The air in Athens was thick with tension, the dust of ruin clinging to every stone. The streets smelled of smoke and despair, for the city had been burned not once, but twice, each time leaving the Athenians with less hope and more anger. In the assembly hall of Salamis, a man named Lycidas, an Athenian counselor, rose above the murmuring crowd. He spoke calmly, rationally, even suggesting that perhaps, just perhaps, they might consider the Persian peace offer. His words were logical, almost mundane. But logic had no place here. The trauma of war had turned minds brittle, hearts feral. The counselors surged forward, their hands grabbing stones from the floor. Lycidas did not have time to react. They hurled the first boulder, then another, then a relentless cascade of rock. He fell, his life extinguished under the weight of fear, anger, and a society that had decided reason was treachery. But the violence did not stop there. Women, drawn by the shouts, by the crack of bone and cries of despair, stormed Lycidas' home. His wife, his children, they became symbols of perceived betrayal. Dragged into the streets, they too were stoned to death. The cruelty of Athens' vengeance, leaving no survivors, no witnesses to testify, only ashes and screams that would echo for generations. This was not fiction. It was 479 BC. Diplomacy was dead. Athens, once a city of philosophers and poets, now spoke only in blood and terror. The Persians were gone, or so they thought, but the threat remained. And waiting in Boeotia was Mardonius, a man who had been left behind not as an emissary, not as a tourist, but as a predator. 300,000 of Persia's finest warriors spread across the plains, a sea of bronze and iron, their eyes cold, their discipline absolute. Athens, a city reduced to rubble, sent runners to Sparta with a message that was no plea. If you do not march, they warned, the Athenian navy joins Persia. Your walls will not save you. The efforts of Sparta, long cautious and slow, could ignore the message no longer. Within a single night, the Peloponnesian landscape shifted. 5,000 Spartiates, the elite, the best-trained soldiers in Greece, prepared to march, and with them, 35,000 armed Helot slaves, pressed into service for a war that was no longer optional. Before dawn, the column vanished from the Peloponnese, dust rising behind them like smoke from a pyre. When the envoys from Athens arrived, still shouting, the ephors checked the sun and said simply, "You are too late. The army is already at the border. The hunt has begun." The Spartans were moving, and when Sparta moves, the world trembles. Meanwhile, Mardonius watched for Boeotia. He did not panic. He had left the slow, cumbersome mass of Xerxes' army behind. The bloated, ineffectual conscripts were gone. What remained were the elite, the deadly, the immortals and horse archers who could pierce armor from 100 yards while riding at full gallop. He had space to maneuver, and he had patience. Athens burned again under his orders. The city turned into ash as a reminder. Mardonius was still here. The Greeks had nothing. No walls, no city, only their anger. And that was all Mardonius needed to draw them into his trap. The plains of Plataea awaited, flat, open, perfect for cavalry, ideal for a man who understood war as a game of chess. And across the mountains, the Spartans marched, a living tidal wave of iron, discipline, and vengeance, ready to meet the storm. The allied Greek army, swelling with soldiers from every city-state that had refused Persia's dominion, crested the foothills of Mount Cithaeron and looked down across the plains of Plataea. From this vantage point, the scene was almost incomprehensible, a glittering sea of tents, horses, and bronze glinting in the Greek sun. Mardonius had built a fortress of wood and earth, square miles of towers and walls forming a living machine of war. The Persian army stretched endlessly across the plains, their discipline and order almost terrifying in its precision. The Greek commanders, led by the Spartan regent Pausanias, surveyed the ground with a mixture of awe and caution. They had come to fight, yet here was the trap. Open plains perfect for Persian cavalry, the Achilles heel of the slow, heavy Greek phalanx. Pausanias knew that a frontal assault would be suicide. The Spartans had faced death before, yes, but choosing it recklessly would mean annihilation. So they held their ground, hugging the rocky foothills, a solid wall of bronze and courage. Days passed. The sun burned down mercilessly, turning the plains into a furnace. The Persian army was patient, almost languid in their arrogance. They did not need a charge. They could wait, confident that the Greek discipline would crack before thirst, hunger, or heat. And yet, Mardonius could not resist a taunt. He sent Mardonius, the cavalry commander of legendary repute, a man whose name was spoken with awe throughout the empire, riding a white Nicean stallion whose bridle gleamed with solid gold. Mardonius led a squadron of Persian horse archers straight up the slopes, a living spear aimed at Greek morale. The cavalry rode in wide, mocking circles, raining arrows down upon the Greeks. They hooted, they yelled insults, their movements designed to humiliate as much as to wound. The Megarians, holding the center of the Greek line, began to waver, their formation straining against panic. Messages flew to Pausanias, "Send help or we break." But any response was a gamble. The Greek infantry, packed tight in the phalanx, could not chase cavalry across open ground. Each step down the slope was a risk, each order a potential death sentence. It was then that a small contingent of Athenians, 300 men echoing the memory of Thermopylae, stepped forward. They carried bows, javelins, and shields, and they charged into the harassment, moving with determination and a sense of vengeance. The clash was chaotic but decisive. Arrows flew, and for the first time, the Persians faced effective retaliation. Mardonius, larger than most men and encased in scale armor beneath his purple tunic, became the center of the storm. The Athenians swarmed him, hacking at his armor with swords that glanced uselessly off the bronze scales. He fought back like a living tank, swinging a sword with the strength of 10 men, blocking, deflecting, and striking. For a moment, it seemed impossible to bring him down. Then, a single Athenian, sharp-eyed and desperate, noticed the weak point, the eye hole of his helmet. With a spear, he drove it home. Mardonius toppled from his horse, the glittering cavalry commander reduced to a heap of purple and bronze. The Greek lines erupted in a roar. The Persians, loyal and proud, surged forward to recover their commander, creating a brutal melee over his body. Yet the Greeks held their ground, lifting the fallen Persian onto a cart, parading him before the army as proof that even the mightiest of Persia could bleed. The victory was small, yet enormous. Morale sord. The Greek soldiers tasted vengeance and felt the first thrill of hope since the burning of Athens. But Pausanias knew better than to let celebration cloud judgment. Mardonius was patient, intelligent, and deadly. This skirmish was not a defeat for Persia. It was an invitation to a far bloodier stage. Mardonius waited, watching as the Greeks settled nearer to the Asopus River, where the vital Gargaphius spring flowed. The Greek line stretched across the foothills, its supply lines thin, its water tenuous. Mardonius did not attack immediately. He let them stew, letting thirst and fatigue gnaw at their resolve. Then, with a predator's instinct, he sent his cavalry around the Greek rear, striking the supply wagons, killing drivers, scattering oxen, cutting the Greeks off from sustenance. Hunger joined fear as a weapon. 8 days of this stalemate stretched on. The sun beat down relentlessly. Arrows fell like rain on the immobile Greeks, and the soldiers crouched behind their shields, sweat and blood mixing with the dust of Plataea. Calls for movement were met with strict discipline. Pausanias forbade the men from advancing or retreating. Each hour of passive suffering became a test of will, a psychological torture designed to keep the phalanx intact until the right moment. But discipline could not quench thirst forever. On the 11th day, Mardonius unleashed a final, cruel stroke. His cavalry trampled the Gargaphius spring, turning the water to mud. Panic spread. The coalition of Greek city-states argued, divided by fear, ambition, and distrust. The Athenians demanded an attack. The Corinthians urged retreat, and the Spartans remained unmoving, their rigid code of obedience a fragile anchor. It fell to Pausanias to act. He decided on a night maneuver, a retreat to a defensible position called the island, closer to fresh water. The plan was sound in theory, but required perfect coordination and silence. Darkness became both ally and enemy. As the Greek army moved, confusion erupted. Contingents panicked. Some sprinted far beyond the agreed lines, leaving the coalition fractured. On the right wing, the Spartans faced a different obstacle. Pride embodied in the stubborn Amampharidas, who refused to follow orders. The night was chaos incarnate. Shouting, scrambling, rocks thrown in anger, commands ignored. The army, once unified, became a mosaic of fear, stubbornness, and miscommunication. Pausanias, desperate, made the painful decision to leave Amampharidas behind temporarily, hoping shame would compel him to follow. Slowly, the Spartans began their withdrawal, stretching across the slopes, vulnerable and disorganized, their discipline tested to its absolute limits. Mardonius watched from the valley, thinking the Greeks were fleeing. He saw a broken, fractured army and ordered the pursuit. The Persian cavalry surged forward, a tidal wave of death, while the elite immortals and infantry advanced in a terrifying chorus of war cries. From above, Pausanias saw the dust rising, the enemy closing, and realized that the carefully constructed balance of control and patience was about to collapse into chaos. The stage was set. The trap of Plataea, the culmination of months of strategy, patience, and revenge, was ready to spring. The Greeks, weary, parched, and fractured, were about to face the full might of the Persian Empire. And yet, in that tension, in that unbearable anticipation, the seeds of Spartan discipline, Greek resilience, and ultimate vengeance had been quietly taking root. Night fell over the plains of Plataea, turning the rolling hills and valleys into a patchwork of shadow and confusion. The Greek army, stretched across miles, was supposed to execute a tactical withdrawal to a defensible position near the island, closer to water and safer from the reach of Persian cavalry. In theory, it was simple: move silently, maintain formation, regroup, and secure supplies. In reality, the darkness amplified fear, pride, and panic. The center of the Greek line, composed of troops from Corinth, Megara, and other allied city-states, was the first to crumble under the weight of tension. Instead of halting at the designated fallback point, fear took over. Soldiers scrambled across the rocky terrain in blind panic, abandoning their shields, abandoning orders, abandoning comrades. By the time dawn crept over Mount Scythian, half the army had effectively removed themselves from the fight. The Temple of Hera in Plataea became an unplanned rally point, a haven for terrified men huddled in the dark, unsure whether they would ever see their homes again. Meanwhile, on the right wing, Spartan pride created an entirely different problem. Captain Amampharidas, commander of the elite Pitanas Lakos, refused to move a single step backward. To him, retreat, even tactical, was anathema. To a Spartan, retreat was shame incarnate, a stain upon the blood of ancestors and the memory of Leonidas of Thermopylae. In the pitch-black night, Pausanias pleaded, argued, and even threatened, but Amampharidas stood firm. In the stillness of the riverbed, he raised a massive stone, slamming it down at Pausanias' feet as a literal vote against retreat. The absurdity of a single Spartan holding back thousands of men in the middle of the night could have been comical, if the stakes weren't so horrifyingly high. By the time the rest of the Spartans began to shuffle away, Amampharidas finally realized that isolation was death. His unit jogged to catch up, but the sun was cresting over the distant mountains, and the Persian sentries were already spotting the movement. Dust rose in huge clouds. Warning signals were passed along the Persian lines, and General Mardonius' smile returned. To him, this was not retreat. It was the perfect trap. The Persian cavalry surged forward, a roaring tidal wave of steel and horseflesh, cutting off the Greeks' rear and striking at their extended supply lines. Tens of thousands of arrows rained down on the sluggish, sunburned, and fatigued Greeks, peppering shields, helmets, and the rare exposed limb. It was an industrial slaughter, relentless and unfeeling. For the Spartan helots, the unarmored conscripted slaves, the storm was apocalyptic. They had been dragged into the war to carry provisions, to assist, and now they were dying en masse, impaled by arrows meant for the bronze-clad warriors they served. Amidst this chaos, the Greeks reached the Gargantua spring, only to find it desecrated. Persian horses had trampled it, churning the once clear water into a muddy slurry, undrinkable and foul. The army, already stretched thin and dehydrated, now faced a crisis that no weapon could solve: thirst. Soldiers dropped to their knees, clawing at the earth, licking mud, anything to quench the burning in their throats. Panic rippled through the coalition. The Athenians screamed for action. The Corinthians argued for retreat. The Spartans, bound by discipline and the iron will of Pausanias, waited, silent and immovable, forming a human dam against chaos. The night became a theater of tension, shadows moving silently through rocks, the sounds of men whispering orders, stepping over bodies, dragging the wounded, all under the oppressive watch of the Persian camp across the river. Every step was a gamble. Every miscommunication could mean annihilation. And then the worst happened. With the Greek forces stretched across the foothills and the supply lines destroyed, the Persian cavalry circled behind them again. This time, their mission was surgical. They struck at the Greek rear, cutting off access to food, intercepting reinforcements, and creating the illusion of a trap that was both physical and psychological. The Greek army, already fatigued, began to realize the enormity of their situation. The Battle of Plataea was no longer just about survival. It was about endurance against an enemy who could manipulate time, terrain, and fear itself. At this moment, Pausanias displayed the brilliance that would mark him as a master of psychological warfare. He did not panic. He did not issue rash commands. Instead, he maintained discipline, forcing the Greeks to hold formation, to endure arrow storms, to remain resolute while the enemy thought victory was theirs. Soldiers crouched, shields raised, waiting for orders for a sign from the gods. In the Greek world, combat was inseparable from religion. Pausanias performed the ritual sacrifices of goats, inspecting their livers for divine approval. The world was collapsing around the men, arrows striking bronze and wicker alike, but Pausanias' unshakable adherence to ritual and order held the line together. The Athenians on the left wing, watching from a distance, understood the precariousness of the situation. They were thirsty, exhausted, and separated from the Spartans. Yet even they did not panic. Every Greek contingent understood that cohesion was their only chance. The Persian archers, emboldened by the Greeks' apparent vulnerability, advanced. The Tegeans, allies of Sparta, wavered, ready to charge without orders. Pausanias, realizing the danger, made a desperate prayer to the goddess Hera, tears streaking his dust-caked face, begging for divine guidance. Then, the omens shifted. The third goat's liver signaled favor. Pausanias stood. No speeches were necessary. The frozen phalanx, 10,000 strong, finally surged forward, releasing months of pent-up rage and fear into a torrent of bronze, iron, and steel. The long-awaited collision with the Persian forces had begun. The passive suffering, the chaos of night, the threat of dehydration, all gave way to the pure, kinetic violence of war. The Persians had erected wicker walls to shield their archers. Against lightly armed infantry, these were effective, but against the full force of a Spartan phalanx, they disintegrated like paper. The Greeks surged, crushing the front lines, breaking through defenses, and beginning the systematic slaughter that would define Plataea. The Othismos, the brutal, close-quarters shoving match of the hoplites, had begun. The sun rose high over the plains of Plataea, casting an unforgiving light on the landscape. Dust hung in the air from the movements of the previous night, clinging to armor, skin, and the already parched throats of men who had gone without water for days. What had begun as a tense standoff, the Greek phalanx holding high ground against the Persians, had now transformed into something far more primal. The Pausanias order had been simple but devastating. Hold formation, wait for divine approval, then advance. The Greek phalanx, statuesque in their discipline for hours under a rain of arrows, suddenly exploded into motion. Bronze shields clanged together, spears thrust forward in perfect synchrony, and the dust rose into towering clouds as the Greeks surged down the slopes, their momentum unstoppable. The Persian front line, composed of immortals and elite infantry, met them with courage and desperation. They thrust their daggers, snapped their short swords against the bronze of the phalanx, and tried to hold the line. But physics was no ally to the Persians that day. Linen tunics and light armor were no match for spear points driven with the weight of men who had trained since childhood to be living battering rams. The wicker shields meant to protect their archers shattered instantly under the relentless push. The othismos, the shoving match of hoplites, was a maelstrom of violence. Men pushed, stabbed, and slammed against each other with mechanical efficiency. Helots, once cowering under arrow fire, now swarmed into gaps with slings, javelins, and knives, finishing off Persian soldiers who were already weakened. The clash was horrifying, relentless, industrial. Dust, blood, sweat, and fear merged into a single choking fog that obscured faces' silhouettes, and even the sun itself had to the center of the chaos. Mardonius sat on his magnificent white horse, a beacon of Persian command. His bodyguard of 1,000 elite soldiers formed a living shield around him. From his saddle, he cut down any Greek foolish enough to come near, a whirlwind of purple cloaks and polished steel. His presence was the glue keeping the Persian army from fracturing, a symbol of order amidst an increasingly chaotic battlefield. But the Spartans were not ordinary men. Step by bloody step, the phalanx ground toward him, crushing the front line of immortals and opening a funnel through which the Greek assault would flow. Spears splintered, swords flashed, and the Persians found themselves trapped between disciplined bronze walls moving inexorably forward. Mardonius' cavalry tried to break the momentum, horses screaming, riders slashing, but the Greek tide was relentless. The Helots pressed from behind, hacking at any exposed legs, cutting down men who had been holding their shields high, and in a horrifying symphony, the Persian lines began to collapse. The sheer weight and discipline of the Greek hoplites was unlike anything the Persians had encountered. They had fought at Thermopylae, yes, but now it was not a small, narrow pass. They were being crushed across a wide, flat plain with nowhere to maneuver. The elite bodyguard surrounding Mardonius fell one by one. The Spartans climbed over their dead, step by step, a living machine designed for one purpose. The head of the Persian general who had burned their city, killed their citizens, and mocked their homes. And then it happened. The moment that would define the entire campaign. Aramnestos, a Spartan of legendary renown, spotted Mardonius on his white horse, high above the dusty melee. With precision born from decades of training, he lunged. Accounts differ. A rock to the skull, a spear through the chest, but the result was identical. Mardonius, the orchestrator of terror, the burner of Athens, the cousin of Xerxes, fell. His horse stumbled and he crashed into the dirt. The effect was immediate. The Persian army, like a serpent cut at the head, began to writhe and break. Immortals who had never fled now threw down their arms, panicked at the absence of command. Artabazus, commanding 40,000 Persian reserves, assessed the battlefield. He saw the Spartan phalanx grinding forward, unstoppable, and made a choice that would cement the fate of thousands. Rather than reinforce the front, he ordered a full retreat, abandoning the Persian army to its slaughter. Chaos rippled through the camp. Archers and infantry clashed desperately in confusion, and the Greeks pressed forward without mercy. The remaining Persian forces, trapped inside their wooden stockade, faced a nightmare. The Spartans arrived at the walls, but their training had been for open field combat, not sieges. The Persians tried to defend, raining arrows from towers, but their wicker barricades were useless against a concentrated assault. Then, the Athenians arrived. Unlike the Spartans, they were skilled engineers. They tore through the wooden walls, creating a breach, and through it poured the combined fury of Sparta and Athens. Inside the fort, there was no mercy. The Greeks moved methodically, slaughtering all who opposed them. Tens of thousands of Persians, once the pride of an empire, were cut down in a mass of blood and dust. The ground was slick with gore, the screams echoing across the plains. This was vengeance incarnate. Thermopylae avenged, Athens avenged. The months of starvation, fear, and humiliation transformed into an unstoppable, methodical rage that by the end of the day, the Persian army was effectively annihilated. Ancient sources exaggerate, claiming only 3,000 survived, but even accepting some embellishment, the scale of destruction was unprecedented. The plains of Plataea became a graveyard, a testament to Greek discipline, rage, and tactical mastery. In the aftermath, Pausanias walked among the spoils. The camp of Mardonius was more than a battlefield. It was a palace of gold, silver, and silk. Temples of imperial luxury, treasures of a king, and the personal wealth of Xerxes' cousin lay exposed. Pausanias, with grim humor, ordered the Persian chefs to prepare a feast, while the Spartan cooks boiled their infamous black broth. The two meals, side by side, symbolized the contrast between the opulence of the East and the austerity of the West, between the hubris of Mardonius and the enduring discipline of Sparta. Yet, even in victory, there were consequences. The man who had mocked Persian luxury, Pausanias himself, would soon be corrupted by it. Reports trickled back to Sparta. Purple robes, lavish banquets, foreign bodyguards. He was becoming what he had just defeated. And the story of the Battle of Plataea would not end with glory alone. It would seed intrigue, betrayal, and the tragic downfall of one of Greece's greatest generals. The plains of Plataea lay silent. Dust and blood hung thick in the air, and the last echoes of battle had faded into an eerie, almost sacred stillness. The Greek soldiers, covered in gore and sweat, were not celebrating. They were absorbing the magnitude of what they had just done. They had faced an empire, stared into its heart, and ripped it apart piece by piece. The price had been staggering, but so had the victory. Pausanias, the Spartan regent, walked through the remnants of Mardonius' camp, surveying the spoils. Tents of purple silk, gold-plated furniture, silver vessels, and chests overflowing with coins lay scattered under the relentless Greek sun. It was wealth beyond imagining, a treasure hoarded by a man who had come to kill them, burn their city, and crush their people. And yet, it was all here, lying at their feet, powerless to resist. With grim irony, Pausanias ordered the Persian chefs to prepare a feast, a luxurious banquet for the Greeks. The Spartan cooks boiled their infamous black broth alongside it, a simple, almost absurd contrast. He laughed as he placed the two meals side by side, mocking the Persian luxury, a symbol of hubris, and declaring to his commanders that Mardonius had died for his pride, not his cause. The victory at Plataea was complete, but it was only the beginning of a very different war, the war for power, influence, and survival in the aftermath. Athens, once a city burned and humiliated, now returned home as a conqueror. Refugees became rulers. They rebuilt their walls, restored their fleet, and established the Delian League, a coalition that was less about mutual defense and more about Athenian dominance. Tribute flowed into the city, turning Athens into a powerhouse of wealth and influence. From the ashes of 479 BC, the golden age of Athens began, a period of philosophy, art, and naval supremacy, but it was built on blood, vengeance, and the spoils of destruction. Meanwhile, Pausanias returned to Sparta, hailed as the savior of Greece, yet carrying a hidden seed of corruption. The victory feast at Mardonius' camp had planted a taste for luxury that the austere Spartan life could not satisfy. Reports soon surfaced of purple robes, Persian-style banquets, and personal guards composed of foreign mercenaries. The regent who had led the Greek army to annihilate the Persian threat now indulged in the very excesses of the enemy he had destroyed. Rumors spread rapidly through Sparta. Pausanias was allegedly corresponding with remnants of the Persian Empire, even plotting alliances that could deliver Greece into foreign hands. He courted the favor of Xerxes' court, offering loyalty in exchange for wealth, influence, and even marriage into Persian royalty. Such reports struck terror into the hearts of the Spartan Ephors. A man who had once embodied Spartan discipline and virtue was now flirting with treachery, bridging the very cultures he had just defeated. The Ephors devised a trap. They hid witnesses behind partitions, secured evidence of his schemes, and prepared to confront him. Pausanias, the hero of Plataea, was now a hunted man in his own city, a general brought down not by swords or arrows, but by ambition, pride, and the intoxicating lure of power. The final chapter of his life was tragic and symbolic. Seeking sanctuary, he fled to the temple of Athena of the Brazen House, invoking the sacred laws that forbade his execution within holy ground. But Sparta had its own rules, and its devotion to law and order outweighed mercy. Unable to kill him inside the temple, the Ephors resolved to trap him. Bricks were stacked, sealing him inside. And in a gesture that encapsulated the ultimate rejection, his own mother placed the first stone upon the threshold, choosing the honor of Sparta over her son's life. Pausanias, the man who had commanded one of the greatest victories in Greek history, was left to starve in darkness. Days passed. The temple became a tomb. No food, no water, only the lingering incense and the cold weight of his isolation. When he finally emerged, emaciated and broken, it was not to triumph, but to death, stripped of glory, honor, and even the agency he had once commanded on the battlefield. Sparta had survived, Greece had survived, but the hero of the day became a cautionary tale of pride, indulgence, and the corrosive nature of power. Even as the dust settled and the sun set over the plains of Plataea, history moved on. Across the Aegean, the Greek fleet launched a simultaneous assault on Persian forces at Mycale. Their ships were burned, the garrison slaughtered, and the war that had raged for decades effectively ended. The West had survived the might of Persia, but the victory was messy. Thermopylae had been noble and tragic. Plataea was brutal, necessary, and morally complicated. The free Greeks had crushed an empire, but the cost was etched into every man who had fought. The survivors carried the weight of slaughter, vengeance, and the intoxicating lure of power. The Battle of Plataea remains a testament to the duality of war, heroism and horror, victory and corruption, discipline and indulgence. 10,000 Spartans, countless allies, and the soldiers of Athens had stood against a superpower and prevailed. But their triumph was also a mirror, reflecting the human tendencies that persist in times of war. Greed, ambition, pride, and the subtle decay of even the strongest MSO. When you remember the 300 Spartans at Thermopylae, remember also the 10,000 at Plataea. Remember the slaughter, the discipline, the rage, and the aftermath. Remember that victory can be as dangerous as defeat, and that even the heroes who save the world are vulnerable to the seductions of power and luxury. And remember Pausanias, a man who saved Greece, yet lost himself, because history is never as clean as legend would have you believe. The plains of Plataea are silent now, but their story echoes through time. Brutal, savage, necessary, and unforgettable. The dust of Plataea had barely settled, and already the reverberations of the battle were reshaping the Greek world. The immediate threat of Persia had been neutralized, but the power vacuum it left was more dangerous than any enemy army. The city-states of Greece, long united only by the fear of foreign invasion, were now staring at one another with suspicion. Alliances forged in blood could just as easily turn into rivalries fueled by ambition. Athens, in particular, was quick to capitalize on its moment. The Athenians had suffered tremendously during the Persian invasions, yet the survival of their city, their people, and their fleet had given them a confidence bordering on arrogance. Refugees returned home to find their city in ruins, temples burned, walls shattered. But instead of mourning, the Athenians began to rebuild, not merely to restore what had been lost, but to surpass it. They reconstructed their walls with the explicit intent of asserting dominance, expanded their fleet to unprecedented numbers, and began forming the Delian League, ostensibly a coalition against Persia, but in reality a tool of Athenian imperial ambition. The Spartan response was more complicated. Sparta had won at Plataea, but the victory came at a cost. The strict Spartan system, built on discipline, obedience, and austerity, was suddenly facing internal cracks. The behavior of Pausanias, once a paragon of Spartan virtue, was emblematic of the problem. He had tasted luxury in the Persian camp, experienced the ease of commanding wealth and indulgence, and he could not return entirely to the austere Spartan lifestyle. The regent's shift from hero to a man intoxicated by Persian spoils sowed seeds of unease among the ephors and generals. Rumors spread that he had been corresponding with Persian remnants, even proposing alliances, and that he had begun amassing a personal following of foreign mercenaries. Sparta, which had always valued conformity over individual ambition, viewed this as an existential threat. The ephors acted decisively, tracking his correspondence and setting a trap to catch him in the act of treachery. The man who had commanded the finest Greek army now became a hunted figure in his own city, a symbol of how power and victory could corrupt even the most disciplined. Meanwhile, the Athenians, flush with success and resources, began extending their influence across the Aegean. Islands that had once been independent or under the sway of other city-states were now required to pay tribute, turning Athens into the de facto empire of Greece. The victories at Plataea and Mycale were not just military. They were the foundation for political hegemony. And in the hearts of ordinary Athenians, there was a sense of pride, of destiny fulfilled, that they were the heirs to a world that had once been threatened with annihilation. Back in Sparta, the regent's obsession with Persian luxury grew. Reports came of purple robes replacing the austere red cloaks, banquets replacing black broth, and private guards composed of Egyptians and Persians surrounding him. Tales of secret letters to Xerxes, promising to deliver Greece into Persian hands in exchange for power and marriage alliances, began to circulate. The man who had fought beside his men at Plataea was now conspiring with the very empire he had destroyed. Sparta could not tolerate this. The ephors moved to arrest him, but Pausanias, knowing the law protected him inside sacred ground, sought refuge in the temple of Athena of the Brazen House. Here, Sparta's devotion to law intersected with brutality. If they could not touch him inside, they would ensure he could never leave. Stones were stacked, sealing him inside the temple. In a gesture that resonated through history, his own mother placed the first stone, signaling the city's judgment, honor above family. Pausanias' fate was sealed. Trapped, starving, and humiliated, he became the cautionary tale of victory's seduction, the man who saved Greece, only to be destroyed by the allure of the enemy's spoils. Yet while individual fates played out in Sparta, the broader Greek world was transforming. Athens, emboldened by victory and wealth, was no longer merely a city-state. It was becoming an empire. Naval dominance allowed them to project power far beyond their shores. Artisans, architects, and thinkers thrived under newfound stability and resources, laying the groundwork for the golden age of Greek culture. Democracy, fragile though it had been, became a tool of expansion. Every tribute, every fleet dispatched, strengthened the idea that Athens was the cultural and military heart of the Greek world. Across the Aegean, the remnants of the Persian Empire reeled. Artabazus and other generals had fled, leaving behind a devastated army, a ravaged camp, and a loss of face that would echo in the empire for generations. Persia, though far from destroyed, would never again hold sway over the Greek mainland. The legend of Plataea became a cornerstone of Greek identity, a story of survival, discipline, and the brutal consequences of standing against overwhelming odds. but for every victory, there were consequences. The heroism of Plataea did not erase the chaos, the death, or the moral compromises made in the name of survival. The soldiers, once disciplined, now tasted the intoxicating power of conquest. Athens transformed its victory into political control. Sparta struggled with internal decay. Pausanias fell from grace. The line between heroism and corruption had been crossed, illustrating a timeless truth. Wars may be won, but the human heart is rarely untouched by the spoils of victory. And so, the world that emerged from Plataea was irrevocably changed. Greece was free, yes, but it was also entering a new era of ambition, rivalry, and internal tension. The victories of 479 BC were monumental, but the human costs, pride, corruption, and political machinations would echo far longer than the clashing of spears and the roar of battle. The plains of Plataea had taught a lesson. Survival demands brutality. Discipline can save lives, but victory is never as simple or pure as the songs of poets would have you believe. And as the sun set on the battlefield, the Greeks began to learn that freedom, power, and history were all dangerous games. Games in which heroes could easily become villains, and victories could breed the seeds of future conflict. The dust had barely settled over Plataea, and already Athens was pivoting from survival to ambition. The city, once a victim of Persian invasion, was now a powerhouse of naval supremacy. Ships that had carried refugees and soldiers to safety during the wars were quickly transformed into instruments of empire. Athens' fleet became the heart of a new alliance, the Delian League. On paper, it was a coalition of Greek city-states committed to defending against future Persian aggression. In reality, it was a tool for Athens to extend its influence and impose tribute, creating an empire without declaring one. The islands and coastal cities of the Aegean had little choice. The memory of Xerxes' invasion was fresh. They had witnessed the burning of Athens and feared Persian reprisal. When the Athenians arrived with fleets, men, and promises of protection, many cities welcomed them, or at least pretended to. Tribute payments became mandatory, yet Athens framed it as a collective defense. Every ship, every coin, every soldier sent reinforced the city's dominance. The fleet grew rapidly, not just in number, but in sophistication. Sailors trained, archers drilled, and artisans worked tirelessly to produce bronze-tipped arrows, catapults, and weapons. Athens' empire was rising, not on conquest alone, but on meticulous preparation and strategic leverage. Meanwhile, Sparta's victory at Plataea was a double-edged sword. The city had triumphed in open battle, yet internally, the strict codes of Spartan society were beginning to strain. Discipline and austerity had always been their foundation, but the lure of Persian wealth had left cracks. Pausanias, once celebrated as a hero, now embodied the dangers of hubris. Even after being sealed in the temple of Athena of the Brazen House, rumors spread of secret correspondence with Persian remnants, intrigues with helots, and the accumulation of foreign luxuries. Sparta, ever obsessed with order and reputation, could not ignore this threat. The ephors monitored Pausanias closely, using spies and servants to uncover proof of treachery. Stories reached every corner of the city. The man who had commanded tens of thousands at Plataea was now surrounded by foreign guards, dining in Persian style, abandoning the simplicity that defined Spartan virtue. His transformation became a warning, not just of the seductive power of wealth, but of how victory can corrupt even the strongest systems. Meanwhile, Persia was far from finished. Although Mardonius was dead and Plataea was a catastrophic loss, the empire still controlled vast territories in Asia Minor and the Aegean. Persian governors, generals, and satraps began rebuilding, consolidating what remained of their forces and plotting ways to reassert dominance over the Greek world. Athens and Sparta may have won the battles, but the war for influence, trade routes, and strategic islands was only just beginning. Every city-state in the Aegean was now a chess piece, and the players were prepared to manipulate, coerce, or conquer to secure power. Back in Athens, the the city's elite embraced opportunity. The riches seized from the Persian forces, including silver, gold, and exotic artifacts, were redistributed in ways that fueled both civic pride and political control. Public buildings were rebuilt grander than before. Temples rose with polished marble, and the Acropolis became a symbol not just of piety, but of imperial ambition. The Delian League was a vehicle for Athens' transformation. Initially, members contributed ships and men voluntarily. Over time, tribute payments became mandatory, and dissent was quietly, but ruthlessly, suppressed. The transformation was rapid and profound. Where once Athens had been a city-state recovering from trauma, it now radiated confidence, culture, and power. Philosophers, architects, and strategists found patronage, while the fleet ensured Athens could project force across the Aegean. The victory at Plataea, combined with naval supremacy, gave Athens both the moral authority and the military means to enforce its will. Yet the story of Plataea and its aftermath was not merely one of triumph. The brutality and human cost of the war were never forgotten. Survivors carried scars, both physical and psychological, and the memories of family, friends, and soldiers lost in the carnage haunted every public festival and assembly. Greece had won its freedom, but freedom was not innocence. It was a battlefield of moral choices, political maneuvering, and human ambition. Sparta, meanwhile, faced the tension between tradition and ambition. The city-state that had once epitomized discipline and simplicity now grappled with a leader whose obsession with luxury and foreign influence threatened to destabilize the social order. Pausanias' story became a cautionary tale, whispered in the corridors of power. A man who achieves greatness in war could still be undone by the temptations of peace, wealth, and pride. Across the Aegean, Persia rebuilt cautiously. Though weakened, its governors maintained watch over coastal cities and islands. Athens' growing empire posed a threat, but the Persians learned from Plataea. Greek unity, though fleeting, could bring devastating losses. Diplomacy, subterfuge, and economic leverage became as critical as armies and ships. The war may have ended in the fields of Boeotia, but the strategic chessboard of Greece was far from settled. The stage was set for the next era. Athens' golden age, Spartan introspection, Persian attempts at influence, and the intricate dance of alliances, betrayals, and ambitions that would define Greece for decades. Victory had been won, but history had only just begun to write the consequences. The Delian League began not as a declaration of empire, but as a defensive pact, a shield against future Persian aggression. Yet, like all institutions built in war's aftermath, it quickly became an instrument of influence. Athens, still flushed with victory and eager to ensure Persia could never return, took the leadership mantle. Fleet after fleet was organized, crews drilled rigorously, and harbors across the Aegean were converted into naval outposts. Even distant islands felt the weight of Athens' rising presence. Where tribute was offered willingly, Athens reinforced loyalty with promises of protection. Where dissent appeared, subtle coercion or outright force was deployed. Ships could blockade ports. Soldiers could march on cities. Payment was inevitable. Obedience became the price of survival. Thus, city-states like Naxos and Thassos quickly learned that resistance was costly. Some attempted rebellion, hoping Sparta or Persia might intervene. But Athens had learned lessons from Plataea. Swift retaliation, combined with naval dominance, ensured that uprisings were crushed before they could gather momentum. The message was clear. Greece had fought Persia together, but in the absence of a foreign enemy, Athens would define the rules. The Delian League, though cloaked in a language of unity and mutual defense, increasingly resembled an empire where Athens wrote the laws, decided the tribute, and dictated policy. While Athens flourished, Sparta's internal struggles worsened. Pausanias, now an enigma even to his own people, drifted further into decadence. The very man who had led 10,000 Spartans to victory at Plataea became obsessed with Persian luxury. Reports trickled in. He wore robes dyed purple with imported Persian dyes, dined on exotic foods, and surrounded himself with foreign guards, a private entourage that included mercenaries from lands he had once defeated. The ephors, guardians of Spartan austerity and discipline, worried that his influence over the military could fracture the rigid hierarchy of their society. A man who had been revered as a hero now loomed as a potential internal threat. Rumors of treachery were subtle at first. Travelers spoke of Pausanias' private letters to Persian nobles, hints that he sought alliances, perhaps even marriage arrangements with Persian royalty. Then came whispers of secret dealings with Helots, the enslaved population of Sparta. The very people Pausanias had commanded at Plataea now promised freedom and rewards in exchange for loyalty to him rather than the Spartan state. It was a dangerous, almost revolutionary notion. For Spartans, the social order was sacred. To arm the Helots was to destabilize everything. Every ephor understood that Pausanias' actions could ignite the tinderbox of Sparta's strict caste system. While internal tensions brewed in Sparta, Athens was leveraging its moment of glory. The influx of Persian wealth, gold, silver, and luxury goods was carefully funneled into public works. Temples were rebuilt in marble, gleaming in the sun, their proportions dwarfing the ruins left by Xerxes' armies. Public spaces and agora were expanded to accommodate the city's growing population, now confident in its dominance. Theaters, schools, and forums became centers of intellectual activity, where philosophers and strategists debated politics, ethics, and the role of Athens as a rising power. Victory at Plataea was immortalized not just in sculpture or epic poems, but in every civic institution that emerged in its wake. The fleet, the city, and the league were intertwined. Tribute payments funded ships, which enforced further tribute collection, creating a cycle that expanded Athens' power exponentially. The city-state transitioned from a victim of war to a coercive authority, able to enforce its will across the Aegean Sea. Islands that had once been autonomous now contributed funds, men, or ships, often against their will. Athens' strategy combined diplomacy, fear, and prestige. Its dominance was both subtle and absolute. Back in Sparta, the ephors grew desperate. Pausanias' influence over the army threatened not just political stability, but the very identity of Spartan society. The people revered the code of austerity, discipline, and obedience. To see their greatest hero indulge in luxury, hire foreign bodyguards, and flirt with Persian power was to watch the erosion of everything Sparta had fought to preserve. The ephors debated and schemed, balancing law, tradition, and the growing threat of internal sedition. It was clear that they could not act overtly. Pausanias was still a royal regent, but they began to lay the groundwork for a subtle trap, intending to bring him back under control without provoking open conflict. Meanwhile, beyond Greece, Persian governors watched the unfolding drama with a mix of despair and opportunity. Their empire, though battered at Plataea and Mycale, was still a formidable force. The Aegean islands remained strategically valuable, and the Persian courts saw Athens' expansion as a challenge, and potentially a weakness. Unlike before, the Greeks were no longer united against a single invader. City-states were now divided, some under Athenian influence, others still wary of Sparta or Persia. The empire could exploit these fissures to regain influence without waging a massive war. Yet even as Athens thrived and Sparta faltered under internal tension, the lessons of Plataea lingered. Greek soldiers and citizens alike remembered the horror, discipline, and brutality of that battlefield. Stories circulated in homes, schools, and public squares. The slaughter of Mardonius' army, the precision of the Spartan phalanx, the courage of the Athenians who had supported their allies at critical moments. These tales were more than history. They were a moral compass, a reminder of both the cost of freedom and the intoxicating power that victory could bring. By the time the first few years of the Delian League passed, Athens had transformed into an empire that resembled a small yet unyielding superpower. Its citizens, once survivors, were now administrators, generals, and naval strategists. Tribute flowed steadily. Armies and fleets grew, and the city's influence reached into the far corners of the Aegean. Yet for all their outward strength, the Greeks could not escape the shadows of human ambition. Pausanias' moral decay, the tensions between city-states, and the Persian threat across the sea were reminders that even in victory, the world was far from simple. The stage was set for a new drama. Athens as a rising empire, Sparta struggling to maintain its rigid traditions, and Persia biding its time, ready to exploit every weakness. The echoes of Plataea reverberated not just across battlefields, but through politics, society, and human ambition. History, it seemed, was not a tale of finality. It was a relentless unfolding of cause, consequence, and human desire. As the Delian League matured, the islands of the Aegean were caught between survival and subjugation. Athens demanded tribute, ostensibly to maintain a fleet for collective defense, yet increasingly it became a tool of coercion. Cities that resisted were not merely ignored, they were punished. Naxos, one of the first to challenge Athens' authority, was a stark lesson in imperial precision. The island had resisted payment, hoping to maintain autonomy under the guise of loyalty to the collective Greek cause. Athens responded without hesitation. Its fleet, sleek and well-manned, sailed into Naxos harbor. Merchants fled, citizens panicked, and the Athenian soldiers swiftly disarmed any local resistance. The oligarchic leaders who had championed rebellion were executed or exiled. Naxos was forced to pay tribute, and its autonomy was effectively dissolved. The lesson rippled across the Aegean. Athens did not negotiate with defiance. This pattern repeated itself elsewhere. Thasos, attempting to resist tribute and asserting economic independence through control of mainland ports and mines, suffered a harsher fate. Athenian forces blockaded the island, cut off supplies, and laid siege to the cities. Months of attrition and psychological warfare broke the spirit of the population. Eventually, Thasos surrendered, stripped of autonomy, and forced to dismantle defenses and pay reparations. Each city subdued was a warning to the next, and Athens' reputation for merciless efficiency spread faster than its fleet. Meanwhile, within Sparta, Pausanias' obsession with Persian luxury continued to grow. Reports from envoys and travelers were alarming. He no longer lived as a Spartan, dressing in purple silks, adorning himself with Persian jewelry, and dining on dishes prepared by foreign chefs. His private guards, mercenaries from Egypt, Lydia, and even Persian deserters, were loyal to him alone. The Ephors grew increasingly concerned. Their society, based on austerity, discipline, and communal identity, could not tolerate such deviation without endangering the stability of the state. Pausanias' indulgences were no longer private vices. They threatened to destabilize the Spartan military and political hierarchy. Worse, whispers of treachery began to circulate. Some suggested Pausanias was secretly writing to Persian nobles, offering alliances or marriage arrangements with Persian royalty. Others hinted he was encouraging the Helots, the enslaved population of Sparta, promising them freedom in exchange for loyalty. To a Spartan, this was nothing less than sacrilege. The very social order that maintained Sparta's dominance rested on the Helots' subjugation. Any attempt to empower them was an existential threat. The Ephors began to lay secret plans to curtail Pausanias' influence without provoking open rebellion. Knowing that confrontation with a man of his stature could ignite civil chaos. As Sparta grappled with its internal crisis, Athens' power projection continued unabated. Fleet after fleet was dispatched to ensure compliance across the Aegean. Islands once independent found themselves paying tribute, contributing men, or providing ships. Those who resisted were met with strategic force rather than frontal assault. Ports blockaded, trade disrupted, and morale undermined until compliance was inevitable. The combination of diplomatic pressure and military intimidation created a network of loyalty, whether willing or coerced, that extended Athens' influence far beyond its borders. Athens also used its growing wealth to fund public works and intellectual pursuits, creating a dual image of power and sophistication. Temples were rebuilt in gleaming marble, public forums expanded, and theaters hosted performances glorifying Athens' victories. Philosophers, historians, and strategists debated governance, military ethics, and the city's role in the Greek world. Athens projected an image of prosperity and enlightened authority, contrasting sharply with Sparta's increasingly insular and troubled society. Yet, the shadow of Plataea still lingered. Greek soldiers and citizens remembered the discipline, the horror, and the triumph of that battlefield. Stories circulated. The precision of the Spartan phalanx, the courage of Athenians who had supported allies, the slaughter of Mardonius' army. These stories were not merely commemorations. They were moral anchors, shaping Greek identity and offering a cautionary tale of power, discipline, and the intoxicating allure of victory. The tension between Athens' rise and Sparta's internal decay was reaching a critical point. Athens, leveraging its naval dominance and economic power, continued to expand. Sparta, once the uncontested military leader of Greece, found itself distracted by internal anxieties and the unpredictable behavior of its greatest hero. Pausanias, caught between hero worship and personal indulgence, was slowly alienating the very people he had once inspired to greatness. Across the Aegean, Persian observers watched with interest. Though Persia had been defeated, the empire still held resources and influence. The Aegean islands, fragmented and divided, provided opportunities for covert influence. Persian governors and satraps recognized that the Greeks were no longer united. Athens' coercion, Sparta's internal instability, and the fractious city-states presented openings to regain lost power. Diplomacy, bribery, and indirect intervention could achieve what armies had failed to do: reassert Persian influence over a Greek world now vulnerable not to conquest, but to internal division. By the time the first years of the Delian League passed, Athens had transformed from a war survivor into a regional empire. Tribute, fleets, and discipline enforced compliance, while wealth and culture ensured loyalty, or at least obedience. Sparta, meanwhile, watched its social fabric strain under the weight of Pausanias' ambitions and decadence. The seeds of future conflict were sown, both internally and externally, as Greek city-states navigated the delicate balance of post-war power, pride, and politics. The stage was set for the next chapter in Greek history. Athens as an imperial power, Sparta struggling to maintain its austere traditions, and Persia waiting for an opportunity to exploit every fracture. The echoes of Plataea shaped every decision, every strategy, and every act of ambition, showing that even in victory, the human cost and the lure of power could never be ignored. The years following Plataea saw Athens transform from a city-state scarred by invasion into the undisputed master of the Aegean. Every ship launched, every tribute demanded, and every military garrison installed strengthened a network of control that extended across hundreds of islands and coastal cities. Athens' leaders, mindful of the lessons of Persia, were meticulous in their approach, maintain obedience through both awe and fear. Naxos, Thasos, and other islands were only the beginning. Charistus and Euboea dared to refuse tribute, claiming loyalty to the idea of freedom for all Hellenes. Athens responded not with negotiation, but with swift military demonstration. Its triremes blockaded harbors, and elite marines landed on the beaches in the dead of night. Citizens who resisted were executed, while others were forced to swear allegiance under oath, ensuring their submission was complete and public. This became a model for Athenian enforcement: speed, precision, and spectacle. The fleet was not only a weapon, but a symbol. Athenians sailed into harbors carrying banners proclaiming victory at Plataea and commemorating the blood spilled to defend Greece. They reminded the people that Athens had endured Xerxes' wrath and now commanded the seas. Art, propaganda, and military presence became intertwined, projecting an aura of invincibility that few dared to challenge. Yet, Even as Athens expanded, Sparta struggled under the shadow of its own hero. Pausanias' obsession with Persian opulence was no longer private indulgence. It was a political and social crisis. Reports reached the Ephors of his fascination with foreign luxuries, his recruitment of mercenary bodyguards loyal only to him, and his secret correspondence with Persian elites. Some whispered that he coveted the throne of a Persian satrapy more than Spartan honor. The Ephors were alarmed. Sparta's identity, built on austerity, martial discipline, and communal loyalty, was threatened by one man who embodied indulgence and ambition. The tension grew when Pausanias began testing the limits of his power. He used helots, enslaved Spartans, as personal guards in defiance of tradition, promising them freedom if they followed his commands. To the Ephors, this was an existential threat. Sparta's social system depended entirely on the subjugation of the helots. Empowering them, even indirectly, was intolerable. The Ephors began to plan quietly, seeking a way to restrain Pausanias without provoking civil unrest or risking rebellion among the Spartan elite. While Sparta dealt with internal instability, Athens continued to expand its reach. Chios, Lesbos, and Samos, islands that had once been proud and independent, found themselves subject to Athenian oversight. Military governors were installed, and tribute was collected with an iron fist. In some cases, dissenters were executed. In others, entire civic institutions were dismantled and replaced with councils loyal to Athens. The psychological impact of these actions was profound. Citizens learned that resistance was costly, obedience rewarded, and the memory of Plataea and the courage shown there was leveraged to justify Athens' authority. Athens' empire was not built solely on fear, however. Culture and civic pride were carefully cultivated. Temples and public spaces were rebuilt. Theaters hosted grand performances glorifying the city and its victories, and scholars and philosophers were encouraged to debate the morality of empire, the ethics of tribute, and the legacy of the Persian invasions. By combining wealth, military might, and cultural influence, Athens created a society that commanded both respect and submission across the Greek world. But the shadow of Plataea still haunted every decision. Soldiers and citizens alike remembered the discipline required to stand against Mardonius' army, the horror of thirst, the agony of passive suffering, and the exhilaration of victory. These memories shaped Athens' approach to governance: maintain strict order, demonstrate power decisively, and exploit both fear and admiration to maintain dominance. Back in Sparta, Pausanias' obsession continued to escalate. He wore Persian-style robes in public, abandoned the black broth, and demanded luxuries for himself that would have been considered scandalous in the traditional Spartan order. His foreign guards acted independently, enforcing his will without regard for local customs. Even his closest allies began to question his loyalty and intentions. Rumors spread that he was negotiating with Persian officials, offering to hand over strategic information in exchange for personal gain. The contrast between Athens and Sparta was stark. Athens grew stronger through discipline, coercion, and strategic governance, while Sparta's internal cohesion frayed under the weight of a single man's ambition. The balance of power in Greece was shifting. Where once unity had allowed the Greeks to repel Persia, now division, pride, and the lure of wealth threatened to unravel the fragile alliances that had preserved Greek freedom. The stage was set for the next great conflict. Athens, confident in its naval superiority and wealth, would continue to assert dominance across the Aegean. Sparta, distracted and divided, would struggle to maintain its traditional authority. And the memories of Plataea, the discipline, the carnage, the psychological mastery of victory, would echo in every decision, every campaign, and every betrayal. The Greek world was entering a period of transformation, one forged in blood, shaped by ambition, and destined to test the limits of loyalty, discipline, and power. Victory at Plataea had saved Greece, but it had also sown the seeds of empire, internal decay, and moral ambiguity that would define the next era of history. In the years after Plataea, the Athenian fleet became more than just a collection of warships. It became the lifeblood of a new empire. Each trireme represented not only military power, but political leverage, and each captain and crew were instruments of Athenian authority. Tribute from islands and coastal cities flowed steadily into the city, allowing Athens to fund massive building projects, sustain its fleet, and assert dominance over the Aegean. But power always breeds resistance. Cities that had once been proud and independent began testing Athens' patience. Naxos, for instance, attempted to withdraw from the Delian League under the guise of self-governance. The Athenians responded swiftly and without mercy. Triremes appeared at Naxos harbors before dawn. Soldiers landed silently, surrounding the city, while a small contingent scaled the walls to secure strategic points. Citizens who resisted were executed. Others were forced to swear allegiance under oath, a public and humiliating affirmation of Athenian authority. This method of decisive, visible force became the standard. Show the consequences of defiance, enforce submission, and maintain psychological control over both the subject cities and the Athenian population itself. In Chios and Lesbos, the pattern repeated. Cities that hesitated to pay tribute were reminded of Plataea, not through speeches or debate, but through rapid military action. The sheer speed and efficiency of Athenian response became a warning. Resistance was futile. Tribute payments were collected, civic councils were replaced with Athenian-appointed governors, and elite citizens who had opposed Athens were exiled or executed. Fear, efficiency, and spectacle were intertwined to create obedience that was as psychological as it was enforced. Yet Athens' power was not built on fear alone. Cultural dominance became a key pillar of control. Temples were rebuilt, theaters showcased plays glorifying Athenian victories, and philosophical debates flourished. Citizens were taught to view Athens as the defender of Greek freedom, the protector against the chaos of Persia, and the rightful arbiter of the Aegean. Victory at Plataea was not only remembered in bronze statues and murals. It was institutionalized as a symbol of Athenian moral and military authority. Every tribute, every garrison, every performance reinforced the narrative. Athens had endured, survived, and now ruled. Meanwhile, across the Peloponnese, Sparta's internal situation grew tense. Pausanias' obsession with Persian luxury and power had not faded. It intensified. He wore purple robes publicly, abandoned traditional Spartan cuisine, and surrounded himself with mercenaries loyal to him alone. More troubling, he began using helots as personal guards, promising them freedom in exchange for loyalty. To the Spartan ephors, this was a crisis. The social system depended on helots' subjugation and empowering them, even indirectly, threatened the very foundation of Spartan society. Whispers of treachery began circulating. Travelers, merchants, and Spartan soldiers returned with reports of Pausanias' correspondence with Persian officials. Some claimed he sought to exchange intelligence for personal gain or even the promise of marriage into Persian royalty. Though these reports were fragmentary and sometimes contradictory, they were enough to alarm the ephors. Sparta, a society built on austerity, discipline, and communal loyalty, could not tolerate the possibility that their war hero might undermine the city from within. The contrast between Athens and Sparta became increasingly stark. Athens projected power outward, consolidating empire and building wealth and culture. Sparta, by contrast, was fracturing internally, distracted by the ambitions of one man whose desires threatened to destabilize centuries of tradition. Where unity had allowed the Greeks to repel Persia, ambition, indulgence, and fear now threatened to unravel the fragile alliances that had secured Greek freedom. As Athens grew richer, its culture more refined, and its fleet more dominant, the seeds of tension between the two great city-states were sown. The Spartans watched Athens' expansion with suspicion, while the Athenians viewed Spartan rigidity and internal turmoil as an opportunity to cement their dominance. Yet, in both cities, the lessons of Plataea lingered. In Athens, citizens were reminded that their empire had been built on the blood of men who had stood against a superpower. And in Sparta, elders knew that their survival had depended on iron discipline, courage, and unity. The memory of Mardonius' army, the heat of the Greek sun, the agony of thirst, and the ecstasy of victory were not just stories. They were warnings, guides, and justifications for every decision that followed. The stage was set for the next great drama in Greek history: the consolidation of Athenian power, the internal decay of Sparta, and the fragile alliances that would either preserve freedom or lead to catastrophe. The shadow of Plataea stretched long, reaching into politics, society, and culture, shaping destinies in ways the survivors could never have imagined. While the Spartans wrestled with the distractions of Pausanias' indulgence, and Athens grew wealthier with every tribute collected from islands across the Aegean, another part of the Greek war machine was quietly preparing to deliver the final blow to the remnants of the Persian Empire in Europe. Plataea had crushed Mardonius and shattered the Persian army in Boeotia, but the Persian fleet remained a threat along the coast of Asia Minor. Cities loyal to Persia were still garrisoned with soldiers who had not tasted defeat, and the navy, though diminished, could still threaten the Aegean trade routes vital to Athens. The Greek strategy was now twofold: consolidate the home front and pursue Persia's forces before they could regroup. The Athenians, now confident from Plataea, took command of this initiative. They coordinated with allied fleets from Samos, Chios, and other Aegean city-states to form a strike force that would challenge the remaining Persian fleet and garrisons. Their target was Mycale, a coastal city where Persian forces had entrenched themselves with a combination of naval strength and land fortifications. What happened at Mycale would prove to be the perfect complement to Plataea, though the nature of the battle was very different. Where Plataea had been a grinding, bloody confrontation between hoplite infantry and professional Persian soldiers, Mycale was a combined amphibious and land assault, blending cunning, audacity, and the raw aggression the Greeks had honed over decades of conflict. The Greek fleet arrived off the coast of Mycale at dawn, their ships cutting through the calm waters of the Aegean. Soldiers and sailors knew the stakes. If they failed here, Persia could still claim a foothold in Greece, and Athens' rising reputation would be vulnerable. The city's defenses were formidable, but the Persians had been demoralized by the defeat at Plataea. Rumors of Mardonius' death had reached them weeks earlier, and many soldiers stationed at Mycale had already begun questioning the wisdom of standing against a united Greek force. The Greek commanders, largely Athenian admirals with experience in both naval warfare and siegecraft, planned a bold maneuver. The fleet would anchor near the shore under cover of early morning mist, while the hoplites and light infantry disembarked quietly to encircle the Persian positions. By synchronizing their naval bombardment with a coordinated land assault, the Greeks intended to overwhelm the Persian forces before they could organize a proper defense. As the sun rose higher, the attack began. Greek archers and slingers moved into position, raining projectiles on the Persian defenders atop the walls of Mycale. The triremes engaged in close combat along the docks, grappling with Persian ships to prevent any escape or reinforcements. The sound of bronze striking bronze, arrows thudding into shields, and the shouting of both armies created a cacophony that mirrored the chaos of Plataea, though on a more compact scale. The hoplites stormed the walls in disciplined formations, using ladders and grappling hooks to scale the fortifications. Unlike Plataea, where the Greek phalanx had clashed with Persian infantry in open fields, the battle here relied on ingenuity and coordination. Greek forces exploited weaknesses in the Persian defenses, identifying gaps in walls and guard rotations, and struck with ruthless precision that by midday, the outcome was becoming clear. The Persian garrison, lacking morale and cohesion, began to crumble under the relentless Greek assault. Soldiers surrendered in pockets, some fleeing to the docks to attempt escape by ship, only to be intercepted by the Athenian fleet waiting offshore. Within hours, Mycale had fallen. The Greeks had not only won a decisive victory on land, but they had neutralized the Persian naval threat in the Aegean, effectively ending Persian ambitions west of the Hellespont. The Battle of Mycale though often overshadowed by the drama of Plataea, was historically significant for several reasons. It demonstrated the Greeks' ability to project military power beyond their own territory. It showcased the rising dominance of Athens as a naval power, and it cemented the psychological blow to Persia. The invaders who had once seemed unstoppable were now being hunted and defeated on every front. For Athens, the victory was a validation of their empire-building strategy. Cities across the Aegean took note of the overwhelming efficiency and discipline of the Greek forces. Tribute, loyalty, and obedience followed more easily than ever before. In Sparta, meanwhile, the news of Mycale reached Pausanias, fueling both envy and obsession. He saw the Athenian navy's success as both impressive and threatening, a reminder that while Sparta had led the land battles at Plataea, Athens controlled the sea. His fascination with Persian wealth and power only intensified as he imagined that the luxuries he had once mocked could be harnessed to extend his influence even further. Thus, the stories of Plataea and Mycale were inseparable. One was the crucible of land warfare that saved Greece, the other the masterstroke of naval supremacy that ended Persian threats in Europe. Together, they marked the transition from desperate survival to aggressive dominance, from defending Greek freedom to asserting it across the Aegean, and set the stage for the next chapter in Greek history. The consolidation of empire, the rise of Athens as a cultural and military power, and the slow, inevitable decay of Spartan unity under Pausanias' ambition. The dust had barely settled on the plains of Plataea, and the waves off Mycale were still stained with blood, yet the Greeks were already thinking beyond victory. For Athens, the wars against Persia had revealed something profound. Unity could achieve the impossible, but leadership could also turn that unity into a tool for power. The Delian League was formed shortly after Mycale, a coalition of city-states ostensibly united to defend against any lingering Persian threat. In practice, it became a vehicle for Athenian dominance. Member states sent ships, soldiers, and tribute, silver, grain, even manpower, to Athens, which now positioned itself as the unchallenged protector of Greek interests in the Aegean. For people who had once fled in terror from Mardonius' army, this newfound confidence was intoxicating. Port after port, island after island, Athens' banners flew. The silver from the contributions filled the city's coffers, funding not just a fleet, but a cultural revolution. Temples, theaters, statues, and schools. Yet while Athens prospered, Sparta's hero of Plataea, Pausanias, was consumed by a darker obsession. The victory over Persia had saved Greece, yes, but had also exposed him to the wealth and decadence of the East. The spoils from Mardonius' camp were a temptation beyond anything Spartan society could condone. In Sparta, discipline and austerity were sacred. In Persia, luxury and power were currency. Pausanias became increasingly drawn to the latter. He began dressing in Persian-style robes, dining on exotic foods, and surrounding himself with foreign guards. His behavior shocked fellow Spartans, who had expected their champion to return home a paragon of austerity, not a man enamored with the opulence of the enemy he had defeated. Rumors spread quickly through Laconia. Pausanias was negotiating with Persian officials, promising, some whispered, to betray the very freedom he had fought to defend in exchange for personal gain. Meanwhile, Athens' transformation accelerated. The Delian League's treasury, initially stationed on Delos, became a source of both military strength and political leverage. Cities that had once been proud and independent now sent their tributes obediently, their own citizens growing wary of Athenian oversight. Some cities resisted, of course, attempting to assert autonomy, but Athens' navy was now too powerful, its reach too wide. Rebellion was crushed swiftly, often with harsh punishment, sending a clear message. Resistance was futile. This period also gave rise to Athenian cultural dominance. Playwrights chronicled the heroism of Plataea and Mycale. Sculptors immortalized the figures of victory, and philosophers debated the moral implications of empire. Yet beneath this brilliance lay a subtle but growing tension. The same system that allowed Athens to protect Greece from Persia now gave it the means to dominate its neighbors, blurring the line between liberator and oppressor. Pausanias, isolated in Sparta, observed all this from afar. Every tribute ship that returned to Athens, every temple built with Persian silver, every story of Athenian bravery deepened his envy and fascination. He began to correspond secretly with former Persian allies, exploring ways to secure wealth and power for himself, even at the cost of Sparta's honor. His obsession was no longer private. It was a political hazard, in a cruel symmetry. The very victories that had saved Greece now sowed seeds of internal decay. Athens grew rich and assertive, projecting power across the Aegean. Sparta, once the unchallenged land power, became vulnerable to the ambitions of its own heroes. Pausanias' personal corruption mirrored the empire-building of Athens. Both were consequences of success, both were fueled by wealth and opportunity, and both would have profound consequences for the Greek world in the decades to come. This is the moment where history begins to pivot. Greece had survived the Persian threat, but it now faced an equally dangerous challenge: what to do with its own success. For Athens, it meant empire. For Pausanias, it meant obsession. For the people of Greece, it meant a future shaped not only by foreign enemies, but by the ambitions, pride, and greed of their own leaders. And yet, even as Athens' ships cut through the Aegean waters and the Delian League tightened its grip, whispers of Persian retaliation lingered. Persia had not forgotten nor forgiven. Across the sea, far beyond Greek sight, Persian princes began gathering forces, rebuilding ships, and plotting revenge. The stage was quietly being set for another chapter in the story. A story of conflict between freedom and empire, between the lessons of Plataea and the lure of wealth, between the courage of heroes and the corruption that comes with power. The consequences of that summer, the blood at Plataea, the fire at Mycale, would echo through generations. But the next battles would not be fought in the open fields against Persian invaders. They would be fought in politics, in the shadows of ambition, and in the hearts of men who had tasted both glory and gold. The hero of Plataea, the man who had crushed Mardonius and saved Greece from the shadow of Persia, now walked a dangerous tightrope between glory and ruin. In Sparta, Pausanias returned not as a humbled warrior, but as a man intoxicated by the opulence he had glimpsed in Mardonius' camp. Gold and silver, silks dyed in purple, spices from far-off lands. They had not only survived him in the Persian tents, they had lodged themselves in his imagination, changing his ambitions that it began subtly. At first, Pausanias adopted Persian ceremonial habits. His cloak was no longer the coarse crimson wool of a Spartan warrior, but a rich purple, embroidered with gold thread. He began enjoying elaborate meals, flavored with herbs and spices that no Spartan could grow, meats roasted to perfection, wine poured from golden amphorae. He surrounded himself with a small contingent of Persian-trained bodyguards, men who obeyed his commands without question, men who did not speak Spartan, who did not adhere to Spartan law, and whose loyalty was bought entirely by his wealth. The Ephors of Sparta noticed. Sparta was a city-state that had survived for centuries on discipline, austerity, and the rigid control of its citizens. Here was their war hero, returned from the greatest victory in Greek history, transforming himself into something unrecognizable. He met regularly with Persian merchants and envoys, even sending letters that some intercepted as hints of collaboration with the enemy. The whispers began almost immediately. Pausanias, the savior of Greece, might be courting treason. Meanwhile, Athens was not idle. While Sparta fretted over one man's obsession, the Athenians were consolidating an empire. The Delian League had become a tool of dominance, a mechanism for collecting tribute from city after city in the Aegean and the Cyclades. Where Plataea and Mycale had secured Greek freedom from Persia, the Athenians used those victories to expand their influence, transforming gratitude into obligation, freedom into subjugation. Ships from Delos arrived daily in Piraeus, carrying silver, grain, timber, and manpower. Each vessel represented a city-state acknowledging Athens' supremacy, willingly or unwillingly. The Athenian navy, already vast, grew into a fleet capable of projecting power across the Aegean Sea, from Samos to Lesbos to Chios. Every conquest, every new tribute, reinforced the idea that Athens was now the arbiter of Greek destiny. Back in Sparta, the ephors faced a dilemma. Pausanias' behavior was scandalous, yet he was their war hero. To confront him directly risked dishonoring Sparta itself. To ignore him risked letting ambition undermine the city-state's rigid laws. They tried subtle warnings first, dispatching trusted elders to remind him of Spartan austerity, of his duty to the state over personal desire. Pausanias listened, nodded politely, then returned to the comforts of Persian-trained servants, the golden trappings, and the wine-heavy feast. It was clear that subtlety would not work. Pausanias' obsession was no longer private. It had become political. He began recruiting helots, promising freedom and positions of power in a future Sparta that he envisioned as a blend of Persian opulence and Spartan might. This was not just ambition, it was sedition. To the ephors, it was unthinkable. To a Spartan, arming the very slaves who had supported them at Plataea was sacrilege of the highest order. The tension grew daily. Envoys from Athens visited Sparta, bringing news of their expanding empire. Athens had begun fortifying its control over islands that had once been allies of Sparta. Some Spartans argued that Pausanias' ambitions might serve as a counterbalance to Athenian power. Others feared he would drag them into a Persian-style decadence from which Sparta could never recover. Meanwhile, Pausanias continued his correspondence with ex-Persian commanders and merchants, secretly plotting a personal empire, one that merged the riches of the East with the authority of Sparta. Across the Aegean, the pattern was clear. Athens' empire was built on the ashes of Plataea, on the blood of Persian soldiers, on the sacrifices of every hoplite who had stood in formation that day. Sparta, meanwhile, was watching its own champion unravel. History was repeating itself, in a way. Victory had brought wealth, and wealth was now breeding conflict within the very cities that had fought so valiantly to secure it. The Greek world was entering a new kind of war, one fought not on the plains of Boeotia or the shores of Ionia, but in the hearts of men, in the corridors of power, in the subtle interplay between ambition and loyalty. Pausanias' obsession with Persian luxury, Athens' imperial expansion, the resentment of city-states coerced into tribute. All these threads were converging toward a storm that would reshape Greece for generations. That was a lesson the world would learn over and over. Victory could save a people, but it could also corrupt them. A hero could be a savior in one moment and a liability in the next. Empires could rise on the blood of enemies, but fall under the weight of their own ambition. And sometimes, the deadliest enemies were not foreign invaders, but the men who had once been celebrated as champions of freedom. As the sun rose over Sparta and Athens alike, the Greeks were poised on the edge of a new era. The shadow of Persia had receded, but the shadow of ambition, corruption, and internal strife was already stretching across the lands. In the next chapter, the tension between Athens and Sparta would explode into a conflict that no Persian army could have forced. The Peloponnesian Wars, a struggle not for survival, but for dominance within Greece itself. While Pausanias squandered his glory in Sparta, Athens was capitalizing on the victory of Plataea like a predator sensing weakness. The city that had once fled its own streets under Persian fire now towered over the Aegean. Its navy, forged in the desperate battles of Salamis and Mycale, became not just a tool of defense, but an instrument of dominion. The Delian League had begun as a voluntary alliance. Greek city-states, shaken by the trauma of Persian invasions, pooled their ships and silver to keep the threat at bay. But Athens, skilled in politics as much as warfare, gradually turned it into a system of control. Cities that had contributed ships found their fleets redirected to Athenian campaigns. Cities that had pledged silver found their treasuries siphoned to Athens' coffers. Tribute lists grew, taxes increased, and the once willing allies began grumbling in private. The tension was palpable. In Chios, merchants whispered about Athenian interference with their trade routes. In Naxos, farmers complained that tribute payments were crippling local economies. In Delos itself, the sacred treasury of a league, Athens moved it to Piraeus, the port city, symbolically making the city both the heart and the heartless overseer of the Greek maritime world. Meanwhile, in Sparta, Pausanias' obsession with Persian luxuries had begun to poison the very fabric of Spartan society. His purple robes, his foreign bodyguards, the promises to helots. It was a scandal, a direct affront to Spartan law and tradition. The Ephors, guardians of the city-state's austere values, began to realize that a hero could become a tyrant if left unchecked. Rumors swirled that Pausanias was secretly negotiating with foreign powers, possibly even Persia itself, under the guise of trade and diplomacy. This contrast between Athens and Sparta could not have been sharper. In Athens, ambition and cunning were rewarded with power and wealth. In Sparta, ambition without discipline threatened to destroy the state from within. And as the Delian League expanded, Athens' confidence grew into audacity. Its leaders were no longer content with merely protecting the Greek world. They wanted to reshape it. Islands were coerced into allegiance, dissenters punished, and naval expeditions became increasingly aggressive. The seeds of the next great conflict were sown quietly but unmistakably. Corinth and other Peloponnesian cities watched Athens with a mixture of admiration, fear, and suspicion. They remembered Plataea and Mycale, remembered how quickly Athens had turned victories into leverage. The pride of Sparta, the resentment of Corinth, and the ambition of Athens created a tinderbox, waiting for the spark. But at the center of all this was Pausanias' downfall, a story as grim as Plataea itself. Despite warnings, the Spartan general's fascination with luxury and power led him to arm helots and correspond with Persian agents. The Ephors, finally compelled to act, set a trap, capturing proof of his treason. Pausanias' final days were a testament to the corrosive power of victory. The hero who had saved Greece from annihilation now lay imprisoned, starved, and humiliated, his own mother placing the first stone in his tomb. Athens, by contrast, was reaching its zenith. Every silver coin from Delian allies, every conquered island, every loyal citizen in the navy reinforced its power. But power has a rhythm, and overreach carries a price. The Greek world was balanced on the knife edge of a new war, one where old alliances would shatter and former comrades could become enemies. The same city-states that had fought side by side at Plataea now began whispering behind each other's backs, calculating the moment when Athens' ambitions could be challenged. The stage was set. From the dust and blood of Plataea, a new kind of conflict emerged. Not an existential war against Persia, but a battle for control within Greece itself. Athens had grown fat on the victories of the past. Sparta was weakened by internal corruption, and the other city-states were caught between admiration, fear, and envy. The Peloponnesian Wars were not yet underway, but their shadows were already stretching across the Aegean, promising a decade of intrigue, betrayal, and bloodshed that would make Plataea seem almost simple by comparison. Victory had saved Greece from foreign tyranny, but it had also exposed the fragility of Greek unity. Heroes became potential villains, allies became rivals, and the line between savior and oppressor blurred. The war against Persia was over, but the war for Greece's soul was just beginning. Athens had become a city of ambition, gilded with the spoils of Plataea and the Delian League's tribute. Ships filled with bronze, silver, and grain arrived daily at Piraeus, each vessel a symbol of the city's growing dominance. Citizens walked the streets, buzzing with confidence, naval officers boasting of victories that once seemed impossible, and politicians whispered in the grand halls of the council, each scheming to expand Athens' reach further. But power has a way of making friends uncomfortable. Across the Aegean, former allies began to squirm. Naxos, a proud island state, refused a particularly heavy tribute request, claiming it was excessive. Chios and Samos grumbled that Athenian magistrates were interfering in local courts and markets. Even Delos, the Sacred Heart of the League, bristled at the relocation of the treasury to Athens. For the first time, cracks in the alliance began to show. The Athenian leaders responded with a mixture of charm and threat. Envoys sailed from island to island, reminding the Delian League members of the Persian threat that still lingered in memory. They spoke of Plataea and Mycale, of the horrors that would return if Athens' naval protection were lost. And beneath the speeches, there were the subtle threats. Refuse tribute, and your fleet may not defend you next time. Every year, the tribute lists grew longer, the payments heavier, and the Athenian treasury swelled. But the more Athens grew, the more other city-states feared it. Corinth, a longtime rival, watched with suspicion. Sparta, scarred by Pausanias' corruption but ever proud, observed quietly, waiting for a moment when Athens overreached. Amid this tension, the cultural and political life in Athens blossomed. Citizens discussed philosophy in the agora, watched plays that dramatized the Persian wars, and celebrated their victories at Plataea as a shared triumph. Yet behind the festivals and speeches, resentment simmered. Many city-states felt trapped in Athens' orbit. They had fought together against Persia, yes, but now they were paying tribute, supplying troops, and answering to Athenian demands. The alliance had begun as a shield against an external enemy. Now, for many, it felt like a cage. Meanwhile, Sparta was slowly recovering from internal turmoil. The disgrace of Pausanias had shaken their confidence, but the Ephors knew that Athens' rising power could not go unchecked forever. They began quietly rallying allies in the Peloponnesus, whispering promises of autonomy and warning of Athenian overreach. Corinth, Megara, and Thebes were all potential partners in a coalition, waiting for the right spark to ignite a broader conflict. Tensions were exacerbated by Athenian naval expeditions that bordered on coercion. Merchant ships were seized to enforce tribute payments. Rebellious islands were visited by triremes carrying soldiers ready to impose Athens' will. The psychological warfare was subtle but effective. Athens was not just a city-state anymore. It was an empire in the making, and empires have a way of stirring fear even in those they protect. This was the world in the decade after Plataea, one where triumph over Persia had secured freedom, but also created opportunity, greed, and ambition. Athens' navy was unmatched, its treasury overflowing, and its citizens proud. But its allies were restless, and its rivals were biding their time. A single misstep, a single act of defiance, could unravel the fragile peace. The seeds of the Peloponnesian War were planted quietly, in whispers and resentments, in secret councils and angry merchants' meetings. Athens' brilliance as a naval power was undeniable, but so was the danger it posed to Greek unity. The very victory that had saved the Greek world from foreign tyranny had set the stage for an internal conflict that threatened to consume the same lands it had once saved. In this tension-filled environment, the stage was ready for the next chapter. Rebellions, Athenian retaliation, and the first steps toward a war that would pit Greek against Greek, brother against brother. Sparta, Corinth, and their allies were waiting, watching, and preparing. Athens, drunk on its own success, believed it could dictate the terms of peace, but history has a way of reminding the powerful that nothing lasts forever. Tea started quietly, almost imperceptibly. Naxos, once a loyal member of the Delian League, refused the latest tribute demand from Athens. The islanders argued that their wealth was being unfairly extracted, that Athens' promises of protection no longer justified the heavy taxes and constant oversight. At first, Athenian envoys tried diplomacy, arriving with speeches and reminders of Plataea, the blood spilled to preserve freedom. But the Naxians were adamant. They would pay no more. Athens did not hesitate. The city-state had transformed. It was no longer just a defender of Greek freedom. It was an empire in its own right. A fleet of triremes, sleek and deadly, sailed to Naxos under the command of stern admiral. Soldiers landed and immediately fortified positions along the harbor. ensuring the island could not flee or receive aid. The Athenian assembly, from behind marble columns in Piraeus, debated the morality of the intervention, but the decision was unanimous. Rebellion could not be tolerated. The triremes struck fast, cutting off any hope of escape, and Athens demanded total compliance. Naxos resisted. They barricaded themselves in the main city, hoping their natural defenses and knowledge of the terrain would allow them to hold out. For weeks, Athens imposed a naval blockade, starving the city, cutting off supplies, and executing daring raids on smaller settlements to demonstrate the futility of defiance. Eventually, the city fell. Naxos was forced to pay the tribute, dismantle its walls, and accept Athenian magistrates permanently stationed on the island. What had begun as a plea for fairness became an example of Athens' uncompromising might. The news of Naxos' defeat spread like wildfire. Other states, Thasos, Lesbos, and Chios, began whispering about their own resistance. Athens moved swiftly, sending fleets before rebellions could gain momentum, sometimes using force, sometimes clever manipulation, a show of wealth, a promise of protection, a subtle threat of destruction. No city could resist, and the lesson became clear. The Delian League was no longer a mutual defense pact. It was an Athenian empire by any measure. This shift did not go unnoticed by Sparta. Across the Peloponnesus, the ephors gathered, watching Athens consolidate power, noting the fear in allied states, and seeing the resentment simmering among the islands. Corinth, always ambitious, sent envoys to Sparta, warning that Athens' expansion threatened the balance of power. Sparta, still recovering from internal upheavals after Pausanias' disgrace, listened carefully. They did not act immediately, but they prepared quietly, training troops, reinforcing fortifications, and ensuring allies were ready to respond when the time came. Meanwhile, back in Athens, the empire's rise fueled internal debates. Wealth flowed into the city, prompting grand architectural projects, theaters, and temples that dazzled the citizens. But these marvels were built on the backs of conquered or coerced allies. And every success, every display of power, was a reminder that Athens' dominance depended on maintaining fear as much as loyalty. Citizens celebrated victories and feasts, unaware or unwilling to consider that the very freedom they cherished for themselves was being denied to others across the Aegean. Tension reached a breaking point with Thasos. The island had resources, timber, silver mines, and fertile lands that Athens coveted. When Thasos tried to resist tribute demands, Athens responded decisively. A fleet landed, blockades were enforced, and after months of siege and skirmishes, Thasos fell. Its walls were torn down, its citizens forced into submission, and its leaders executed or exiled. The message was unmistakable. No one could defy Athens without paying a severe price. Each victory brought wealth, but also whispers of dissent. Some Greek city-states, particularly in the north, began covertly sending messages to Sparta. They argued that Athens had become the aggressor, that it was no longer the protector of Greek liberty, but a tyrant of the seas. Sparta listened. They could see the logic. If Athens' power grew unchecked, it would dominate the Greek world entirely. A reckoning was inevitable. By now, the Delian League was more of an Athenian empire than a cooperative alliance. The golden triremes patrolled the Aegean, coercing payments, enforcing loyalty, and ensuring Athens' supremacy. Yet every conquest, every submission, planted seeds of resentment that would bloom into rebellion. The Greek world was stable on the surface, but beneath that calm, the sparks of civil war were already igniting. That it was a dangerous era, an empire built on fear and tribute, citizens intoxicated by wealth and power, and a coalition of former allies watching and waiting for the right moment. The shadows of Plataea's victories loomed large, reminding all Greeks that Athens had proven itself capable of incredible force. But force alone would not guarantee loyalty forever. The stage was set for a story of internal conflict, betrayal, and ideological struggle. the tale of Athens against the rest of Greece, where former allies became enemies, and the lessons of foreign war collided with the challenges of ruling one's own people. The smoke of Plataea had barely cleared, the blood of the Persian hordes still staining the soil, when Athens, triumphant and emboldened, turned its gaze to the sea. The islands of the Aegean, once grateful for Spartan-led defense, now looked at Athens not as a liberator but as a master. The city-state that had once been a refugee, burnt and desperate, had become a superpower overnight, its influence stretching from Samos to Thrace. Yet, as with all empires, power brought both splendor and decay. Naxos had been the first to resist, Thasos the second, and every act of rebellion revealed a harsh truth. Athens' dominance was a fragile, tense thing, maintained by triremes, armies, and the ever-present threat of destruction. In Athens, the assembly debated endlessly. Philosophers argued about justice, while generals enforced obedience with iron fists. The ideals that Plataea had symbolized, freedom, courage, resistance to tyranny, were now wielded by Athens itself as a weapon against its own people. Sparta watched silently, its pride simmering like molten iron beneath its stoic exterior. The Ephors knew the history too well. A state forged in discipline, valor, and caution could not stand idly by while another Greek city grew so powerful it threatened the balance of the Peloponnesus. Corinth, Megara, and other wary allies whispered in secret halls. Athens had become what Persia had sought to be, an empire bending the free cities of Greece to its will. The seeds of the next great conflict were planted in whispered conversations and secret councils, a slow burn destined to ignite into the Peloponnesian War. Amid this rising tension, Athens citizens celebrated their empire. The wealth flowing in from tributes fueled grand temples, magnificent theaters, and naval dominance. But beneath the celebration, the memory of Plataea lingered, a reminder of the fury the Greeks could unleash when pressed. That lesson was never forgotten. Courage could win battles, but hubris could sow rebellion. Pausanias had conquered Persia and tasted its gold, yet even he fell victim to the corruption of victory. Athens now faced its own test. Could it wield power without succumbing to the same flaws that had doomed their Spartan hero? And yet, as history often reminds us, empires are not linear tales of glory. The same hands that had driven back Xerxes' armies now enforced tribute, executed rebels, and demanded loyalty. Freedom had become currency, liberty a tool, and the shadow of Plataea, the blood, the sacrifice, the hard-won survival, had transformed into a blueprint for control. Each conquered or coerced island was a grim reminder that the victory over Persia, though monumental, came with a cost. The Greeks had proven they could slaughter, but they had also learned to govern through fear. In this way, the story of Plataea closes not with a triumphant finality, but with a warning. The 10,000 who faced the Persian apocalypse did not just save Greece. They created the conditions for internal strife, for empires to rise and fall, for morality to bend under the weight of power. The lessons of Thermopylae, of heroism and noble sacrifice, were immortalized in legend. Plataea, however, teaches something harsher. Survival can demand ruthlessness. Victory can corrupt, and the line between hero and tyrant is perilously thin. And so, as the sun set over the Aegean, casting long shadows across the rebuilt walls of Athens, the people celebrated. The triremes gleamed in the harbor, and the islands trembled beneath the weight of tribute. Across the Peloponnesus, Sparta prepared in silence, knowing that the next great war was inevitable, a conflict born not of Persia's ambition, but of the fragile, dangerous might of their own fellow Greeks. The story ends here, but the echoes of Plataea, the courage, the horror, the unflinching discipline, and the consequences of victory resound through history. It is a tale of survival and vengeance, of glory and corruption, and of the inexorable cycle of human ambition. The free cities of Greece were saved that day, but the lessons they learned would shape the destiny of the Mediterranean world for centuries to come. The battlefield of Plataea, soaked in blood and dust, reminds us of one truth that resonates far beyond history books: that freedom is won with unimaginable courage, maintained with constant vigilance, and lost when power corrupts the heart of those who wield it.